it takes you to this other place and it affects you. So I think I like using Phil as my own drug, because drugs in the real world are really nasty and really have terrible consequences. If you read A Scanner Darkly, you'll see that list at the end of the book where all these people who died that he knew, and he said their only mistake was, playing in a garden that they didn't know was so dangerous. And so that's something we have to consider when we think about his work. Another big question that comes up with Phil, and I'm going to write this one with a question mark. Was Phil mentally ill? Yeah, he did have several suicide attempts, so about 4 or 5, and they were considered pretty serious. At one point, he overdosed on his heart medication, and he said it was, a very Phil K. Dick experience, because he's in the hospital and his heart is beating at like 180 times per minute, and they've got all of these medical students who are coming in and monitoring him because, oh, this is fascinating. This man is still alive. And so he remembers just sitting there, like he had, this experience where he feels like he's not human, he's not being treated as a human. And he went to 3 therapists in his life. The first therapist said, you do have a mild kind of case of paranoid schizophrenia. The second therapist said, you're completely healthy, there's nothing wrong with you. And then the third therapist said, you're Philip K. Dick, and you're impossible. It's impossible to tell whether or not you're mentally ill or not, because you're Philip K. Dick. And apparently he came in once and they said, let's do some free association.
Uh-oh.
And the therapist walked out kind of like, oh, what's going on? He went on for a full hour nonstop about what is the nature of reality and what is consciousness and time, and do we die, and if we die, where do we go when we die, and just went for it full bore. Again, Kyle Arnold in The Divine Madness makes a very compelling argument that he was not mentally ill. He was an addict, which is similar but different. He was addicted to amphetamines. But one of the main categories, and we can talk about this later too, of mental illness is that it has a deteriorating quality. And he was able to use his very odd view of looking at the world in a way that enhanced it. I mean, he was able to use his kind of oddness to make a living as a science fiction author. And that's all he really ever did. He worked in a record store briefly during his teenage years, and then he became a science fiction author. At one point, he was so poor that he had to hold up his pants with like a piece of extension cord. So we'll talk about that. But I'm in the boat that he did have some issues, but I would not argue that he was a person who was considerably mentally ill, even though he did have his troubles. Another important thing, and this is where it gets a little uncomfortable, we talk about with Phil as a person, is he had some problems with relationships.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the real kicker, specifically with women. He burned through a lot of people. He used them kind of like they were drugs. And pretty famously, one of his agents who was retiring wrote some notes. And in the notes, the agent said, Philip K. Dick, science fiction writer. Number 1, do not loan him money. Number 2, he will steal your pills. And he had some serious problems connecting with people. And I think that's why he was an incredible writer, because he had this deep loneliness. He was married 5 times, and he was never able to really make a functional relationship that worked. And here's the real one that's a kick in the teeth for me, is that you can see it in his fiction. He's got a lot of female characters who end up as kind of one of 3 archetypes. They're either the dark-haired girl who's the seductress, they're the bitchy wife, or they're the transcendent, godlike woman who is so perfect I can't understand it. And you'll see those kind of played out through a lot of his fiction. He did correspond with Ursula Le Guin quite a bit, and she eventually called him out publicly. I believe she said, and it was either a fanzine or a science fiction magazine, that Phil Dick was slowly going crazy in Santa Monica. And he took that pretty personally, and he ended up writing this great book called The Transmigration of Timothy Archer, in which he has a fully actualized female character who has agency. And he wrote that. It was the last book he ever wrote. So if you're feeling like, he's got some problems with women, because he does. In my favorite book, The Three Stigmata, I believe he describes 4 or 5 women only in terms of the size of their breasts. Like, come on, Phil. Maybe that was the style at the time. I don't know. And I do think about that when I read him, and I kind of wonder about it. At the same time, I would not say he was a misogynist. He had deep empathy for people. There was a time in which a young girl, like 19 years old, needed a ride to the hospital, and he took her to the hospital, and he gave her a bus ticket home, and he spent a lot of his money that he needed for himself on other people. So, very complex person, Philip K. Dick.
What was his family background? I mean, was he an only child? Was he...
Yeah, thank you. I was gonna mention that. So where are these relationships with this problem with women come from? Well, he was born a twin, and a lot of people don't know that. His sister Jane died about 3 months old. Here's the quick story for you. They were living in Chicago. The mother was not doing well. They were very poor, and they got a routine checkup from a nurse. This is really weird and fascinating. The nurse immediately saw that both of the kids were very sick, and they were rushed to the hospital. Jane died a couple days later, but Phil lived. And a big reason for that was because Chicago at the time, in the late 1920s, was one of the first hospitals that had an artificial womb. So it's kind of weird to think of Phil as a baby being one of the first ever children who were in an artificial womb. And is that why he was able to write androids so well? Like, whoa, And I do think about that. And the ultimate, what gets even more problematic here is that he was recorded as saying in the exegesis that about 4 or 5 years old, his mother blamed him for his sister's death. And she said, "You got all the milk." And he internalized that as a very young boy, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. And that's why in his fiction you'll see all these instances of doppelgangers and all these instances of fake doubles and fake twins, because he was trying to reconcile this heavy guilt that weighed on him his whole life, that his mother kind of unfairly pushed on him, even though she was also grieving and she wanted to blame someone else. I don't know. So it doesn't forgive him for his relationships and the way that he writes a lot of female characters. However, it does kind of explain where it's coming from, I think. And we can take a little bit of solace in that. One last thing about Phil the person I want to mention, and this does show up in some of his books. He uses a lot of what would be considered now as kind of racist terminology, especially in, do I have it up here? Oh yes, The Crack in Space. This is such a cool book. Sorry, I'm not giving this one away. This book is about, this is where he's a science fiction prophet. This is very much a B book by him. I wouldn't even recommend it until after you've gone through my recommended reading list. By the way, that list that's in your packets is my preferred order. So if you're new to Philip K. Dick, I would start with The Man in the High Castle, then I would go into Do Android's Dream, and I wouldn't read something like The Three Stigmata until you've had 5 or 6 Philip K. Dick books under your belt. The Crack in Space, though, is this very B book. I mean, look at the guy on the front. He's got some kind of a weird, I don't know if it's an antenna or if it's a rocket launcher or something. But in this book, which was written, I believe, in 1958, there is an African-American president of the United States of America. And one of the big issues at the time is immigration. And it's whoa, it's kind of weird to read about it because, who would have known that some of those things happened pretty closely to how it happened in the real world. This book also has a space kind of this giant satellite up in space with all these women. I don't know, has anyone here read this book, The Crack in Space? Anyone? It's one of the 44. I think about, he's trying, because he kind of knew that if people could leave and go off-world, that there would be kind of this sinful thing that's happening, and so there's this satellite run by these, again, twins, these businessmen who go up to the satellite, and it's like a space brothel, and they come back down. And it's well, that obviously didn't happen. Yeah, but we do have the cam girl phenomenon, which is pretty similar when you think about it. So it's another thing that he kind of predicted that we have to kind of loosely translate it. And then, of course, this is also about a time rift happening through reality, and there's like a whole alternate world, and I don't think that's happened yet, but maybe they're keeping it under wraps, right? Okay. So the big one up top. Let's go to that really quickly before we move on to the questions of what is reality. This is what I admire most about Phil, and I wish I could be like him in this way. And it was his commitment to poverty. Oh my gosh. He said when he was 19 years old, I'm going to be a science fiction writer, and I'm going to make it as a science fiction writer. And at one point in his life, he would go to the dog food store where they sold dog food, like dog-only meat, which was horse meat, and he would buy the dog meat, you know, and then feed it to his family. So he was really full pot committed to this science fiction writer thing. There's also another story of him getting a check in the mail for like $2.50 royalty check, and having to immediately run down and cash it and then go buy food, you know, because they had no food in the house. And part of me is like, you know, maybe you shouldn't have had kids and tried to start a family and do that. But at the same time, he was really committed to writing and the craft of writing and the art of writing. And I wish I were that committed. You know, I kind of like having running water, and I kind of like not having to eat dog food. So I think we can all get a little bit leaner. And Justin said that also in our graduating workshop. He said, you know, the most important thing about being a writer is keeping a low overhead. And so I do think about that. How can I live a little bit cheaper and commit more of myself to writing, which I know is not going to pay hardly anything. All right. Anything else we want to talk about? Phil as a person or Phil as an author? Questions? Yeah, Liz?
I'm curious about whatever inherent racism you found in his books. Is it nomenclatures? I mean, is it just is he using the terminology of the time to refer to people of color, or is it that there's actually the societies that he creates, the future cultures are themselves reflecting the racism of the time?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely, he uses a lot of the terminology at the time, which now we would consider as like racist terminology. I believe in the Kraken space, he calls a lot of people culls. He calls Italian people wops and that kind of things, and like whoa, we should not do that today. But in the 1960s, it was very common to use those terms, right? Even though it was kind of wrong. Also, one of Phil's main overarching themes was war and his fear and hatred of war. And he saw racism as a kind of war. You know, it's a war against a person for no other reason than that they look different than you. And so he hated it, and yet he knew it was part of kind of our innate humanness, that we are innately racist. And he did not like that. And so you will see some like themes of it throughout his work. Yeah. I hope is that good enough? Okay. Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering, I mean, given the depths of strangeness that he goes into in his writing, if you could really link, or I guess it's sort of like a vicious cycle with regards to his potential mental illness and drug abuse problems, you know, was there an inability to separate himself from his work?
I would agree with that completely. If you look at Phil's work, when you read enough of it, you'll realize that it's all him. All the characters are him. All of the worlds are him. And there's a person I presented with at the Science Fiction Research Association who's making the argument that Phil's schizophrenia was able to manifest an entirely alternate world that he would go into. And it was so complete, it was almost like the real world. And there's evidence of that. There's a really cool book for the real Philip K. Dick people. It's called Appendix Dick. It's by a guy named Tommy Bren. He's German. And he has taken all of Philip K. Dick's work and he's analyzed just the names in the work, because Phil never used like another name, or if he did use someone's name, you could see it. He wrote like a 1954 short story, and then he would write like a 1970 novel, and he would be the same person in the two. And like, how do you remember that? He had this whole alternate world constructed, and he would go into that world for his writing. So I like to think of him as inviting us into the world that he's built. So yeah, definitely, it's going to get weird. It's Phil Dickian, so just expect it.